What's up, everybody? What's going on today? So, you want to talk about zombies? I sure do. It's a fascinating subject. And, years ago, when I first watched Walking Dead or Night of the Living Dead, or any of these other shows, my thought was that, God, that's so absurd. Even after all the zombie shows I've watched, I thought, how would that really be possible? If these creatures are animals or people are dead, then how could they become zombies? And I thought, okay, so what's the potential if the blood was still flowing? What if the heart was still beating, but the mind was just taken over? It's funny because with all the science that I've learned through the years and all the discoveries and I'm fascinated with biology and how the brain works, and I've become more likely to believe that a zombie outbreak is completely possible than ever before. And so I thought I would share a few reasons why with you all, because I know everybody loves that scenario. Not loves it, but I'd rather, it's a very popular theme. In fact, many would argue that it's already a metaphor for where we're at right now with the consumer culture, but I could go on about how viruses actually can affect the brain in a way that cause you to think differently. It's well known with felines, cats, who carry in their toxoplasma. Toxoplasma gondii is what it's called. And toxoplasmosis is the condition which is caused by cat feces. And you inhale this and it gets into the brain. The old thinking was that it can lay dormant or activate later. This has been disputed recently, found that they don't lay dormant. They incubate over a very long period of time. And these viruses incubate over such a long period of time that your body doesn't have a chance to recognize them as intruders. Now, viruses have been with us since ancient times. One of the most fascinating things I discovered is that without viruses, we would not exist and could not exist. In fact, there's a particular virus that's involved in the splitting of the zygote, if I'm not mistaken. Something to do with the egg, and without it, we wouldn't be able to even reproduce. And the interesting thing about viruses is that they reproduce by hijacking a host cell. They can't reproduce, most viruses can't reproduce on their own, so they need a host cell. And you may think, well, maybe they didn't evolve yet, or they just haven't evolved the ability. No, they actually have in the past. There's these giant viruses which they've found that perhaps viruses over time just decided they don't need to. And one might ask, what is the purpose of viruses? And if you don't believe that anything has purpose, then I guess that's not a question that even has any point in discussing. But for people who believe that nature is entwined and that everything maybe not has a particular purpose that we can define, but rather everything fits in a niche, and when a niche is disturbed, viruses can come in and take out large populations that become basically leeches like humans have. So I'm going to read you a couple of these little interesting things. I'm going to tell you why I got into this was, years ago, I, of course, sold cordyceps on my website for a long time. Cordyceps sinensis, which this is a cousin of it, which is Cordyceps militaris. And this is a parasitic fungus that grows on a silkworm. So this is a silkworm cocoon with cordyceps growing out of it. These were grown, usually these cordyceps are grown, if they're indoor grown, they're grown on a grain substrate or something similar. But these are kind of a specialty item. And yes, you're supposed to eat the worm too, but I haven't tried them yet. Anyhow, this is a totally different process. This is where we talk about fungus, because fungus, Cordyceps sinensis, I believe it's militaris or a variety of cordyceps. Cordyceps sinensis grows on caterpillars in Tibet, and they find them growing out of the ground. When the caterpillars burrow in, they will grow out of the head of the caterpillar. Now, there's a particular strain of cordyceps, which, picture a spore from this fungus traveling through the woods. It lands on an ant, latches onto that ant. Then the spore literally explodes. It pops with a power for its size that is very, very powerful, puncturing the cell, the hard exoskeleton of the ant. Once it's punctured the exoskeleton, it can get inside, and it instantly goes to the brain. It takes over the brain of the ant. It tells it to climb down from its nest in the trees, to walk down across the forest floor, to a very specific elevation usually, then to climb up a tree or a small bush, climb out to a branch at a very specific height, and I believe it's about 3 feet. Then they are to climb to the underside of the leaf, latch on as tight as they can, and then they die. And after they die, these cordyceps erupt from their whole body. It's fascinating, but this is a fungus. This is a fungus that takes control of an ant and causes it to do something. Well, let's go back to toxoplasmosis. And the reason why this virus exists, or I should say how it reproduces, is fascinating. It gets into a rat or a mouse. It does the same thing. This is a virus, though. It goes to the rat's brain, and it reprograms the brain to not fear the smell of cat urine, and to actually sexually be attracted to cat urine in some way. So when it smells cat urine, it'll go out in the open and seek out the cats. The cat will eat the mouse. Toxoplasma will go through the feces. It will get back in. It will continue to reproduce this whole life cycle. And how does it do that? You know, how does it know how to control the mind of the host in a way? Well, you might think, well, that's just specific to rodents. The reason why it's dangerous for pregnant women to deal with cats is the same reason. It can actually damage the fetus or the brain of the woman, they believe. But everyone should be aware, of course. There were some studies done that I looked at years ago, and I'd have to reconfirm this, that found that people who died in motorcycle accidents or car accidents tested higher if they were, say, speeding or doing something reckless when they died. A lot of people were tested and found that people who died from reckless behavior had a higher rate of toxoplasma gondii in their brains, because you can only see it after you're dead. And that was pretty fascinating. It turns out that when it does get into a human's bloodstream, it can make people more reckless. Fascinating. I mean, so do viruses control us? In fact, years ago I talked about this bacteria idea. It was probably like 5 years ago. I made a YouTube video, and I said, are bacteria our gods? And I think I made 2 of them now. And I still hold out this idea that bacteria, they affect our moods, they're in our guts, they produce 90% of the serotonin and dopamine. We are always talking about our brains, but the vagus nerve that goes between the gut and the mind is a very important factor. If we don't feel well in our stomachs, it can give us problems with, depression, anxiety, and the same thing turns out to be true with viruses. They're finding there's a link between viruses and depression in some cases. So I better read you the information before I just end up rambling on. The information I did download that's at least some sort of scientific fact, right? And this is relating to why viruses, we may be more related to viruses than we realize, or how important they are. According to 2 papers published in the journal Cell in January, long ago a virus bound its genetic code to the genome of 4-limbed animals. That snippet of code is still very much alive in humans' brains today, where it does the very viral task of packing up genetic information and sending it from nerve cells to their neighbors in little capsules that look a whole lot like viruses themselves. And these little packages of information might be critical elements of how nerves communicate and reorganize over time. Tasks thought to be necessary for higher order thinking, the researchers said. And this is from an article saying that now they're starting to believe that consciousness may have arisen from viruses. Now, of course, if you're religious, you're going to completely disagree with that and dispute it, and that's fine. I'll just continue on. Though it may sound surprising that bits of human genetic code come from viruses, it's actually more common than you might think. A review published in Cell in 2016 found that between 40 and 80% of the human genome arrived in some archaic viral invasion. 40 to 80% of our entire genome arrived through a viral invasion. Now, viruses don't just destroy. They also couple, and they change and morph and mutate. A virus is a genetic parasite. Okay, but the new papers take things a step further. Not only is an ancient virus still much active in the cells of human and animal brains, but it seems to be so important to how they function. The processes of thought as we know them likely would never have arisen without it, the researchers said. Now you could take that for what it is, but it's pretty fascinating to me. The fact that bacteria and viruses can affect our thinking and our minds leads you to wonder if we aren't just packages or vessels for consciousness that has arisen and decided it wants to take a larger form. Think of this. What if we are AI for viruses? What if viruses are like us and they're seeking, an artificial intelligence or a spaceship, a way to carry them off this planet to a new place? They've decided as a whole. Now, this is totally absurd, but why is it absurd? Why is it so hard to think that viruses that have been around for much longer than humans, are actually consciously aware in their own way as a whole? This would only be true if you believed in the morphogenic field. We'd have to get into Rupert Sheldrake and all these old, other speakers, which gets into pseudoscience a lot of the time. And so I'll just leave it at that, and you can think what you choose. Here's one. Though it was first dismissed as people simply being blue about getting sick, doctors now accept that there is a condition called sickness behavior. This condition is marked by cognitive deficits, drowsiness, general malaise, and other depression-like symptoms in those with an infection. Moreover, in a 2013 Danish study, researchers found that people who had been treated from a severe infection were 62% more likely to suffer from mood disorders. Perhaps related, those who had an autoimmune disease were 45% more likely to have such a mental health issue. So you would think, well, yeah, of course, if you're sick, you don't feel well. But exactly what is the correlation between that? Why would it cause depression? These new discoveries, we are just on the precipice of a whole new world, whether you like it or not, whether you support it or not, whether you're totally opposed to transhumanism or AI or any of these things, they're here, and they're here to stay. So the best we can do is just kind of be educated about not so much the technology that's coming, but the technology that nature has already created in order for itself to be so successful and to evolve. And this is where we get back to zombies. The most likely candidate for a mutation and a zombie-like virus would be the rabies virus. Rabies is likely 100% fatal, as far as we know. It can take time to incubate. Once it does, it causes a fear of water, a fear of bright lights, just like zombie movies. The thing about zombie virus is that, or a rabies virus, is you have to be bitten. And it causes aggression, and it causes animals to bite one another, and it's spread that way. So, if a person gets rabies, which is very rare, like maybe 2 cases a year in the U.S., there are ways to, get a vaccine. But that's only because it's spread through bites. If it were to mutate, it would be a totally different story. So let me read you one last horror scenario. Unlike movie zombies, which become reanimated almost immediately after infection, the first signs a human has rabies, such as anxiety, confusion, hallucinations, and paralysis, don't typically appear for 10 days to a year, as the virus incubates inside the body. Once rabies sets in, though, it's fatal within a week if left untreated. If the genetic code of the rabies virus experienced enough changes or mutations, its incubation time could be reduced dramatically, scientists say. Many viruses have naturally high mutation rates and constantly change as a means of evading or bypassing the defenses of their hosts. There are various ways viral mutations can occur, for example, through copying mistakes during gene replication, or damage from UV light, or my own one. I guess I didn't copy any more after that. I hadn't gotten that far. What it's saying is that if it mutates into an airborne disease, an airborne virus, which it very well could, we'd be screwed. And it would be a very interesting thing to see a bunch of zombies running around. But I think it's a very unlikely scenario, of course. But it's still one to consider, and one to think that it's very possible. And the idea that we can just write it off as something from the movies, that's to our own loss if we're not aware. If you start seeing major changes in people's attitudes and behaviors, you might wonder if a virus is wiping through the society. And when populations get too large, nature has a way of controlling these populations. You can call it God, you can call it chance, you can call it nature's immune system, whatever you want to call it. An example is when too many animals are in one area. A particular acacia tree started producing a toxic substance which didn't allow the animals who ate it to digest the material, and therefore a whole bunch of animals were dying in these South African nature reserves. And they finally traced it back to the trees putting out defense mechanisms because they were being eaten too much. Is it too hard to believe that the Earth as an ecosystem may be able to put out its own defensive mechanism? And since we've only spent a couple hundred years completely about destroying the environment, hopefully the Earth doesn't kick our ass too bad, but I would not be surprised if a virus mutated not for the sake of chance or random mutation, but for the sake of the Earth saying, alright, I'm going to get these fuckers out of here. It's worth a thought. Take care, everybody. Be well. Thanks for coming to Carbo's channel, yo.